In the heart of the forest, where sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, Charles walked as if searching for something he'd lost long ago. The morning sun filters through the trees, dappling the forest floor with shifting patches of light. Charles, a wealthy but lonely man in his early 50s, walks slowly along the familiar trail. His tailored coat brushes against the foliage as he clutches a worn cane, a prop more for habit than necessity. His face, framed by greying hair, is etched with years of solitude. For Charles, this daily walk is his only escape from the cold, empty halls of his mansion. But today, the forest feels different, almost alive with whispers he cannot place. As he nears a small stream, the peaceful silence is shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps and a muffled sob. He freezes, his sharp gaze scanning the dense undergrowth. Then he hears it again, a stifled cry. "Is someone there?" he calls out, his voice firm but not unkind. From behind a bush, a frightened girl emerges. She clutches a stuffed animal so tightly that its seams are stretched. Her clothes are torn, and her eyes are wide with fear. Charles takes a cautious step forward. "Are you all right, child? What are you doing out here alone?" The girl trembles, backing away slightly. I don't know. I think I'm lost. I can't remember." Her words dissolve into quiet sobs. Charles kneels, softening his expression. "It's all right. You're safe now. My name is Charles. What's yours?" "Barbara," she whispers. As they talk, Charles pieces together that Barbara has no memory of how she ended up in the woods or who her family is. His initial instinct is to call for help, but something about her vulnerability tugs at him. He glances toward the direction of his estate, a place he hasn't shared with anyone in years. "Come with me," he says at last. "You can stay at my house until we figure this out." Barbara hesitates, but eventually nods, clutching his hand as they walk toward the mansion. The grand estate rises like a shadow on the hill, its stone facade both majestic and foreboding. As Barbara steps inside, the vast emptiness seems to swallow her small figure. What happens next will change their lives in ways neither could imagine. Will Charles help Barbara uncover the truth about her past, or will the secrets of the mansion unravel them both? Stick around to find out. And if you're intrigued by the story so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned until the end for a shocking twist. Charles shows Barbara to a room that hasn't been used in decades. "You'll be safe here," he says, though the unease in his voice betrays him. But as night falls, something stirs in the quiet halls. A faint whisper echoes through the corridors, and shadows move where no one stands. Charles begins to wonder if bringing Barbara home has awakened something long buried, or if the mansion itself holds answers to her mysterious past. Barbara wandered through the mansion's vast halls, her eyes wide with wonder. Everything around her seemed to belong to another world, a world of wealth, mystery, and stories she couldn't quite grasp. The ceilings stretched so high they seemed to touch the sky, adorned with intricate chandeliers that glimmered faintly in the dim light. Paintings of somber faces hung on the walls, their eyes following her as if they too were curious about the young visitor. Her small hand brushed against the polished wooden banister as she climbed the grand staircase. The sound of her footsteps echoed, each one reminding her how quiet the house was. The stillness felt heavy, yet she wasn't afraid. Instead, there was a strange comfort in knowing she wasn't alone. "Barbara!" Charles called from downstairs. She hurried back, her little shoes tapping lightly against the floor. When she reached him, he was standing by a side door, one she hadn't noticed before. His expression had softened since they first met in the woods. "I'd like you to meet someone," he said, his voice low. He opened the door, revealing a cozy sitting room that felt warmer than the rest of the house. Inside sat an older woman in a high-backed chair, her hands resting on a knitted shawl draped over her lap. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, though strands had slipped free, giving her an air of quiet fragility. She stared out the window, her eyes distant, as if searching for something only she could see. "This is my mother, Sandra," Charles said gently. Barbara stepped forward, unsure of what to say. Sandra didn't look at her, didn't even seem to notice her presence. Barbara glanced at Charles, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Hello," Barbara said softly. There was no response. Sandra remained still, her gaze fixed on the trees outside. "She doesn't always respond," Charles explained, his voice tinged with sadness. "She has Alzheimer's. Some days are better than others." Barbara didn't know what Alzheimer's meant, but she understood that Sandra was different. She tilted her head, studying the older woman's face. There was something kind there, hidden beneath the layers of silence. Without thinking, Barbara began to hum a tune, a lullaby she didn't remember learning but somehow knew by heart. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper, but it filled the room with a gentle warmth. Sandra's hands twitched slightly, and her eyes shifted from the window. She turned toward Barbara, her expression changing. For the first time, there was light in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. "That song?" Sandra murmured, her voice faint but clear. Charles's head snapped up. He stared at his mother, his heart pounding. "Mother? You recognize it?" Sandra didn't respond, but she hummed along, matching Barbara's melody. Charles's throat tightened, and for a moment he could hardly speak. He knelt beside Barbara, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Keep going," he urged softly. Barbara nodded and continued humming, her voice growing steadier. She glanced at the piano in the corner of the room, its surface gleaming even in the dim light. "Do you play?" Charles asked, noticing her gaze. "A little," Barbara admitted. Charles stood, his voice full of quiet hope. "Would you play something for her? Maybe. It will help." Barbara hesitated, but then walked to the piano. She climbed onto the bench, her small hands hesitantly pressing the keys. The notes were soft, uneven at first, but as she played, Sandra's humming grew stronger, filling the room with a sense of something lost but momentarily found. For the first time in years, Charles saw his mother smile. It was faint, fleeting, but unmistakably real. He sat back, his mind racing with the possibilities this small moment had revealed. The days that followed were unlike anything the mansion had seen in years. Barbara's cheerful energy filled every corner, chasing away the stillness that once hung like a heavy curtain. She wandered through the house with growing confidence, her soft laughter echoing down the vast halls. Even the old floors seemed to creak less under her small footsteps, as if welcoming her presence. Charles watched her from a distance at first, unsure how such a small child could have such an immense impact. He found himself drawn to her curiosity and the way she seemed to bring light to everything around her. The grand piano, which had sat untouched for decades, now rang with simple, joyful tunes as Barbara explored its keys. Sandra, too, began to show more signs of awareness. Though her moments of clarity were fleeting, they were enough to fill Charles with hope. One afternoon, Charles found Barbara sitting cross-legged on the floor of the library, surrounded by piles of books. She held a faded picture book in her hands, its edges frayed with age. "Do you like stories?" Charles asked, stepping inside. Barbara looked up with a wide grin. "I love them. Do you have a favorite?" Charles hesitated, his mind racing back to his own childhood. It had been so long since he'd thought about stories, let alone shared one. "There's a book about a boy who finds a hidden garden," he said at last. "I used to read it with my mother when I was your age." Barbara's eyes lit up. "Can we read it together?" For a moment, Charles was caught off guard. No one had asked him to do something so simple, so human in years. "Of course," he said, clearing his throat. He retrieved the book from a high shelf, its green cover worn but intact. They sat by the large window, the sunlight streaming in as he began to read aloud. Barbara leaned against his arm, completely absorbed in the tale. Charles's voice softened as he turned each page, and for the first time in a long while he felt something stir within him, a quiet joy he'd forgotten was possible. Later that evening, during dinner, Sandra had one of her rare moments of clarity. She looked across the table at Barbara, her gaze steady and warm. "You remind me of someone," Sandra said suddenly, her voice strong and clear. Barbara looked up, surprised. "Who?" Sandra smiled faintly. "Family. You feel like family." Barbara's eyes widened and she glanced at Charles, unsure what to say. Charles froze, his fork suspended in mid-air. The word family echoed in his mind, filling him with an emotion he couldn't quite place. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Mother, are you feeling all right?" Sandra nodded slowly, her expression soft. "I haven't felt this good in years. Thank you for bringing her here." The room fell quiet. Barbara's small hand reached out and rested lightly on Sandra's. The gesture was simple but profound, bridging the years of distance and silence that had separated them all. That night, Charles sat alone in his study, staring into the crackling fire. His thoughts were tangled, but one thing was clear. Barbara had done more than just brighten the mansion. She was changing them all. For the first time, the house felt alive, like it was no longer a place of shadows and silence. It felt like a home. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the mansion transformed. The heavy silence that had once filled its halls was now replaced by the sound of laughter, footsteps, and music. Charles found himself smiling more often, a sight so rare that even the old house seemed to take notice. Barbara had become the heart of the mansion. She filled every room with her joy and curiosity, bringing life to corners that had long been forgotten. The once dusty dining room was now a place where meals were shared, stories were told, and memories were made. Even the grand staircase, which had always seemed more imposing than inviting, now echoed with the sound of Barbara racing up and down its steps. One evening, Charles stood by the window in his study, looking out at the forest where he had first found Barbara. The memory of that day was still vivid. The fear in her eyes, her trembling hands, and the quiet courage she had shown. He thought about how much had changed since then, how much she had changed him. The thought grew heavier in his chest until it became undeniable. She belonged here. She was more than a guest, more than a temporary presence. She was family. The next morning, Charles gathered his courage and approached Barbara, who was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing pictures with crayons she had found in an old desk. "Barbara," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I have something I'd like to ask you." She looked up, her big eyes curious. "What is it?" Charles knelt beside her, taking her small hand in his. "Would you like to stay here forever, to be a part of this family officially?" Barbara's face lit up, her smile so bright it seemed to make the entire room glow. "You mean, you want me to stay?" "I want to adopt you," Charles said gently. "If that's what you want to." Tears welled up in Barbara's eyes, but they were tears of happiness. She threw her arms around Charles, holding him tightly. "Yes, I'd love that." Sandra, who had been sitting nearby, watched the scene unfold with a warm smile. Though her mind often wandered, in this moment she was fully present. "She was always meant to be here," Sandra said softly. Over the following weeks, the mansion became a place of celebration. Charles worked tirelessly to make the adoption official, And when the day finally came, the house was filled with a joy it hadn't seen in decades. That evening, in the music room, Barbara and Sandra sat side by side at the grand piano. Sandra's hands, though shaky, moved with surprising grace as Barbara guided her through a simple melody. Charles stood by the doorway, watching with pride as the two played together. The harmony between them was more than just music. It was a symbol of everything they had built together. For the first time in years, the house felt truly alive. The walls seemed to hum with warmth, as if the mansion itself had been waiting for this moment. Charles joined them at the piano, placing a hand on Barbara's shoulder. She looked up at him with a grin. "Do you want to play too?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll leave the music to the experts." As the melody filled the room, Charles felt a deep sense of peace. The mansion was no longer just a house, it was a home, a place filled with love, laughter, and belonging. Outside, the forest seemed to glow under the moonlight, the same forest where their journey had begun. But now, it wasn't just Charles who walked its trails alone. Together, they were a family, and the mansion, once so cold and empty, had finally found its heart.